this day and age, a large amount of goods is handled in shipping containers. These can be quickly and easily transferred between lorries, trains and ships, and are much more efficient than reloading the goods each time. There is now a container terminal at Nabford, and it's the main hub for goods being shipped off Sodor. Loads from all across the island are brought here to be sorted and put onto trains going beyond the Northwest Railway. Some shipments are already in containers when they're brought to the yard, and are just loaded onto the special container flat cars. Others are in trucks and lorries, and need to be transloaded into containers at the yard's warehouse. One morning, James arrived at the container terminal with a train full of goods, most of which was to be sent to destinations on the mainland. He was in a bit of a hurry, as he was due to take the express once he'd finished this goods run. But, as he approached the warehouse, he saw that both of the transloading tracks were occupied.
There's supposed to be a track free.
James brought his train to a halt. He knew that the trucks, once they'd been unloaded in the warehouse, were taken back to the main yard by diesel.
"I'll find out what's going on,"
replied the Red Engine's driver. He quickly jumped down from the cab and headed over to the warehouse. He returned a few minutes later.
"Seems there's been an increase in traffic here and at the main yard. That new pickling plant at Peel Goddard started shipping by rail."
Surely that doesn't account for all this.
"Well, furniture factory in Normanby's just upped production too. Diesel's been overwhelmed with all this extra work."
James was dismayed.
You mean it's going to be like this from now on?
"Afraid so. We'd best get this sorted. The trucks on track 2 are clear to be shunted."
Grumbling, James set to work. This was the last thing he needed, he thought. Not only did he have to shunt, but he was going to be late taking the express. He soon had the empty trucks on a storage track, and quickly shunted the trucks he'd brought into the warehouse. Just as he was finishing, the warehouse manager stepped out. "James, I've just had a call from your controller. She'd like you to go to the sheds when you're finished here."
But what about the express? I'm supposed to be taking that next.
"I'm afraid she didn't say anything about that." A moment later, James was uncoupled from his trucks. He chuffed off to the sheds. Sure enough, the Fat Controller was waiting when James arrived at the sheds.
"James, I've asked Patrick to take your express run, and I'd like you to take his fast goods up to Barrow. I've arranged for the other railway to take it from there."
Ma'am, about the delay.
The warehouse manager explained what happened, James. It wasn't your fault.
Thank you, ma'am, but, well, I still miss one turn of taking the express.
The Fat Controller paused. Although she did know all the engines fairly well, she'd never really understood why James attached such importance to passenger trains, and the express in particular.
"James, I'm due to take the express this evening, and you're welcome to take my place. I'll look after your slow goods, if that's alright with you, ma'am."
Of course.
Bear left a moment later, and the Fat Controller watched him go, thoughtfully. Something would need to be done about the workload at the container yard, she thought. After all, it was only going to get busier. Meanwhile, on another part of the island, Bill was bringing a string of trucks out of one of the China Clay Quarry's numerous tunnels. As he exited, an ominous creak sounded from one of the tunnel's steel supports. Another one came a moment later. Bill whistled, alarmed.
"Get out! The tunnel's about to collapse!"
He shouted to the workmen. He stopped just outside the tunnel. Half a dozen worried workmen joined him a few moments later.
"What happened?"
asked the foreman. Bill explained about the creaking he'd heard. An annoyed look crossed the foreman's face.
"Bill, these steel tunnel supports are brand new. You should know that. You and Ben helped install them last month. There's bound to be some settler."
A loud crash sounded out, interrupting the foreman. Glancing back, Bill saw that the tunnel was now filled with rocks.
"What was that? The tunnel collapsed. Warn the workmen, they need to get clear."
Ben quickly chuffed off to deliver the warning, and Bill looked at the foreman.
"Was there anyone in there?"
"No. We all got out, thanks to your warning."
"Good."
A few hours later, Edward arrived with a train of empty China Clay trucks and quarry supplies. It was one of his usual runs, but this time there was a single coach at the head of his train. Bill and Ben watched, curious, as the blue engine stopped next to where the quarry manager was waiting. Some people climbed down from the coach in Edward's train.
Who are those people?
Health and safety inspectors from Natford. They're here to investigate this morning's collapse.
I see. I hope they don't take too long.
Following the accident, all work at the quarry had been halted, pending the investigation. With nothing to do, both twins were getting bored.
They'll have to make sure the quarry's safe before you can go back to work.
We know that, Edward. We just don't want to be stuck with nothing to do.
A moment later, the quarry manager strode up to the twins. He looked rather disappointed.
Bill and Ben, I'm afraid I have some bad news. Between clearing out the tunnels and the safety investigation, we're going to have to close this quarry for a few months.
The twins stared at him, horrified.
A few months?
I'm afraid so.
Edward departed a few minutes later, with the China clay that had been mined before the collapse. He'd seen how dismayed Bill and Ben had been, and couldn't help wondering if there was something he could do. Every evening, Edward takes a train from Natford along his branch line, which leaves a few minutes after the evening express. As usual, both trains were waiting for their passengers to board.
Did I see Patrick taking the express earlier this afternoon?
Edward knew that James had been scheduled to take that run.
Yes.
Replied the red engine, and he explained about the delay at the container yard.
Bear offered to swap my slow goods run for this express when he heard about it.
Well, we all know the Wildnorwester's your favourite run.
A moment later, an idea struck Edward. He began looking along the platform, searching for the one person who always came to see these evening departures.
Excuse me, Miss Hat.
The fat controller, who had been waiting on the platform, strode over.
Evening, Edward.
Evening, ma'am. James told me about his delay at the container terminal earlier, and that's given me a bit of an idea.
What would that be?
Have you heard that the China Clay Quarry is to close down for a few months?
Yes, the quarry manager emailed me.
Edward outlined his idea while the last of his passengers boarded. When he'd finished, the fat controller nodded thoughtfully.
That would certainly solve a couple of problems. Good thinking, Edward.
Thank you, ma'am.
Edward smoothly departed a few moments later, very much relieved. Early the next morning, the China Clay twins were already awake, but, with no work to do, boredom was beginning to set in.
I spy with my little eye something beginning with R. Is it rails? Yes, your turn. I spy with my little eye something beginning with...
Bill hesitated for a moment as a movement caught his eye.
Something beginning with C.
Ben glanced upwards.
Clouds? No.
A moment later, Ben spotted a familiar vehicle crossing the quarry.
Car!
He exclaimed triumphantly. Then he frowned.
Isn't that our manager's car? It is.
The car stopped next to the sheds, and the quarry manager climbed out. He was accompanied by a woman in a business suit who the twins didn't recognize.
Bill and Ben, allow me to introduce Miss Emily Helen Hutt.
Nice to meet you, Miss Hat.
Bill frowned.
I think I've heard your name before.
You might have. The engines call me the Fat Controller.
But you're not fat.
It's more of a title than a description.
Explained the fat controller, and she glanced over at where the investigators were inspecting the collapsed tunnel.
Edward told me you two would be out of work for a few months.
Yes, we're already getting bored.
Ms. Hutt would like you to come and work for her until we're able to reopen here.
The twins exchanged an excited glance.
What sort of work?
It's become clear that our container terminal needs a dedicated shunter. I'm trying to find another engine, but for the moment, I'll be needing an engine or two to look after it. You'll be working with trucks mostly, and may be needed in the main yard every now and then.
Will we be busy?
Very busy.
Bill glanced over at his twin.
Sounds good, doesn't it, Ben? Sure does, Bill. So, when do we start at the container yard?
As soon as you can.
10 minutes later, the twins' drivers had the two engines steamed up and ready to go. They eagerly departed for Nabford, with the Fat Controller riding in Ben's cab. She was glad they'd been able to help out too. It had worked out well for both the North West Railway and the quarry. The money the railway was paying for Bill and Ben's time at the container terminal would help keep the China Clay Quarry afloat until they could resume operations. Later that afternoon, James was bringing a goods train into the container yard. Just like yesterday, he was in a hurry, as he was due to take the express. As he entered the terminal, a strong feeling of annoyance and déjà vu came over him.
I thought the tracks were supposed to be cleared.
The Fat Controller had told him she'd made some arrangements. But before his driver could reply, one of the cuts of trucks began moving under the transloading crane, seemingly of its own accord. James gasped, then spotted a plume of smoke rising from behind the loaded containers. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the engine pushing the trucks.
What are you doing here?
Ben and I are working here for a few months.
Bill said, and he quickly explained about the accident at the China Clay Quarry.
I see.
Just leave your trucks in the siding over there. I'll take care of them.
Thank you.
Leaving his trucks in the arrival siding, James chuffed off to take the express. He was glad the container terminal was being looked after. It meant less chance of delays for him and the other engines, after all. But at the same time, he knew what Bill and Ben could get up to. Hopefully, he thought, they wouldn't be too mischievous.